The winter of 1944 pressed down on the Eastern Front like an iron fist wrapped in ice. In a small military depot outside Kassel, Germany, 23-year-old Heinrich Müller stood before the skeletal frame of a Nashorn tank destroyer, his breath forming clouds in the frozen air. The machine towered above him, all sharp angles and exposed mechanics, looking more like a coffin on tracks than a weapon of war. Heinrich ran his calloused hand along the cold steel plating, only 8 millimeters thick on the sides. A child could probably punch through it with enough determination, he thought bitterly. His commanding officer, Hauptmann Friedrich Weber, approached from behind, boots crunching on the frost-covered ground. "You have been assigned to Jagdpanzer Unit 525, Weber said, his voice carrying the weight of a man who had delivered this news too many times before. "You will command a Nashorn. Report to the training yard at 0500 hours tomorrow." Heinrich's stomach dropped. Every soldier on the base knew what assignment to a Nashorn meant. They called them Hornissen, Hornets, but the dark joke among the ranks was that they stung their own crews more often than the enemy. The statistics were whispered in barracks after lights out. 68% casualty rate. More than 2 out of every 3 men who climbed into those machines never climbed back out. "Sir," Heinrich began, his voice cracking slightly, "I trained on Panzer IVs. I know nothing about tank destroyers." Weber's expression did not change. "None of you know anything. That is why training starts tomorrow." Dismissed. That evening, Heinrich sat in the mess hall with his younger brother, Klaus, who served as a radio operator in the infantry. Klaus was only 19, with the same blonde hair and blue eyes as Heinrich, but where Heinrich had grown gaunt and serious over 2 years of war, Klaus still carried traces of boyish optimism. "A Nashorn," Klaus said quietly, pushing his watery soup around his bowl. "Heinrich, that is practically a death sentence." Heinrich stared at his own untouched meal. "I know. Can you request a transfer?" Klaus asked desperately. "To where?" Heinrich laughed without humor. "Every position is a death sentence now. At least in a Nashorn, I might take a few Soviet tanks with me before I go." The truth was more complicated than Heinrich let on. The Nashorn was a paradox of German engineering, a weapon that could kill at ranges other tanks could only dream of, mounted on a chassis that offered its crew almost no protection. The 88mm gun could punch through Soviet armor from 2 kilometers away. But the open-top fighting compartment meant a single artillery shell airburst, a strafing aircraft, or even rifle fire from elevated positions could massacre the entire crew. The next morning, Heinrich met his crew. There were 4 others, all young, all terrified, though they tried to hide it with cigarettes and forced bravado. There was Ernst, the gunner, a former factory worker from Munich with steady hands and poor eyesight in his left eye. Otto, the loader, had been conscripted from his family farm in Bavaria only 3 months earlier and still flinched at loud noises. The driver, Matthias, was the oldest at 32, a veteran of the French campaign who had survived this long through a mixture of skill and luck. Finally, there was young Peter, barely 17, who would serve as the radio operator and assist with ammunition. They gathered around their assigned vehicle, number 217, which looked no different from any other Nashorn. Angular, unforgiving, and disturbingly vulnerable. The lack of a roof made it feel less like a tank and more like an artillery piece that someone had foolishly decided to make mobile. Hauptmann Weber addressed the assembled crews, 11 Nashorns in total, 55 men standing at attention in the pre-dawn darkness. "Gentlemen," Weber began, his voice echoing across the depot yard, "you have been chosen for this unit because the Reich needs tank killers. The Soviets outnumber us 5-1 in armor. Your job is to even those odds. The Nashorn can destroy any Soviet tank in service from distances they cannot even range us. You will use this advantage. You will strike from concealment and relocate before counter-battery fire arrives. Speed and distance are your armor, not steel." A young soldier from another crew raised his hand timidly. "Sir, what about air attacks? The Soviets have complete air superiority in most sectors now." Weber's jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "You will pray they do not spot you." Next question. The training was brutal and fast. They had 1 week to learn everything: gunnery, tactics, maintenance, emergency abandonment procedures. That last part took half a day. The instructor, a scarred sergeant missing 2 fingers, made them practice bailing out of the vehicle again and again until they could do it in under 5 seconds. When the enemy shoots back, he told them matter-of-factly, "You will not have time to think. You will only have time to move. The men who hesitate die first. The men who panic die second. The men who move might live." On the 6th day of training, Heinrich finally fired the 88mm gun for the first time at a ranged target. The massive weapon kicked back with shocking violence, the entire vehicle rocking on its suspension. The target, a rusted Soviet tank Hulk 1,500 meters away, simply disintegrated, the shell punching completely through both sides of the armor. Ernst whistled low. "That is incredible." Heinrich stared at the destroyed target, then at the thin walls around them, at the open sky above their heads. The deployment orders came on a gray March morning. Unit 525 was being sent to the Silo Heights, the last major defensive position before Berlin. Soviet forces were massing for what everyone knew would be the final push into Germany. Heinrich and his crew loaded their meager possessions into number 217 and joined the convoy heading east. The journey took 2 days through roads clogged with refugees fleeing westward. Old women pushed carts filled with everything they owned. Children walked barefoot in the snow. Soldiers with hollow eyes trudged past, retreating from battles already lost. Heinrich watched them all from his exposed position in the fighting compartment and felt the weight of what was coming. When they reached the heights, the devastation was already apparent. The landscape was torn apart by months of fighting, forests reduced to splintered stumps, villages erased from existence. They dug in their Nashorns along a ridge overlooking a vast plain where Soviet armor would have to advance. The first engagement came 3 days later, just after dawn. Peter heard them first over the radio, frantic reports from forward observers. 30 Soviet T-34 tanks advancing in formation, supported by infantry and self-propelled guns. "Ernst, range the lead tank," Heinrich ordered, his voice surprisingly steady despite his racing heart. 2,200 meters, Ernst called out. "Fire when ready," the 88 roared. Through his periscope, Heinrich watched the lead T-34 erupt in flames, its turret lifting off like a toy. The Soviet column halted in confusion. "Reload. Next target. 2,100 meters. Fire." Another kill. Then another. In 6 minutes, number 217 destroyed 7 Soviet tanks. The remaining T-34s scattered, trying to locate where the devastating fire was coming from. That was when Heinrich made his first mistake. He hesitated, just for 30 seconds, watching the enemy retreat, feeling a rush of victory. Weber's words echoed too late in his mind. "Relocate before counter-battery fire arrives." The Soviet artillery found them. The first shell landed 50 meters short, spraying the Nashorn with frozen earth. The second landed 20 meters behind them. "Move," Heinrich screamed. "Matthias, get us out of here now." The engine roared to life, but the third shell landed directly beside them. The blast wave hit like a physical fist. Otto, who had been standing to load the next round, took shrapnel across his back and collapsed. Peter was thrown against the radio equipment, blood streaming from his nose. Ernst's left ear was simply gone, replaced by a ragged wound. Matthias drove them out of the kill zone while Heinrich tried desperately to stop Otto's bleeding with field dressings that immediately soaked through crimson. Otto looked up at him with terrified eyes. "Am I going to die?" he whispered. Heinrich could not answer. He could only press harder on the wounds and pray to a God he was no longer sure was listening. Otto died before they reached the field hospital, his blood pooling on the metal floor of the fighting compartment. Heinrich held him through the final minutes, feeling the young farmer's body go still in his arms. Ernst sat in shock, a bandage wrapped around his head where his ear had been, unable to hear anything on his left side. Peter recovered, but something had broken inside him. His hands shook constantly now. They received a replacement loader the next day. His name was Johann, a veteran transferred from a destroyed panzer unit. He was quiet, efficient, and climbed into number 217 without hesitation, stepping over the dark stain where Otto had bled out. No one had time to properly clean it. The second engagement came within hours. Soviet infantry had infiltrated their lines during the night. Heinrich was pulling maintenance on the gun when rifle fire cracked overhead. Bullets pinged off the armor, ricocheted inside the open compartment. Matthias took a round through his shoulder. Another caught Peter in the leg. "Return fire," Heinrich shouted, grabbing his rifle. But they were tank destroyers, not infantry fighting vehicles. They had no machine guns, no way to suppress enemies at close range. Ernst tried to traverse the main gun low enough to use high explosive shells, but the angle was impossible. A Soviet soldier appeared at the edge of their position, raising a grenade. Heinrich shot him twice, watched him fall backward. Then another appeared. And another. They were being swarmed. "We have to abandon," Johann yelled. "We cannot fight them like this." Heinrich knew he was right, but abandoning the Nashorn meant losing their only advantage against Soviet armor. It meant failure. It meant Otto had died for nothing. Then he saw it. A T-34 advancing behind the infantry, using them as cover, getting closer. 300 meters. 250. "Load armor-piercing," Heinrich ordered. "We need to leave," Johann repeated desperately. "Load the damn shell." Johann slammed a round into the breech. Ernst, half-deaf and bleeding, aligned the gun with pure instinct. The T-34 was at point-blank range now, close enough that Heinrich could see the commander in the turret. Fire. The shell traveled less than 200 meters before impacting. The T-34 exploded so violently that the shockwave knocked Soviet infantry off their feet. Secondary explosions tore through the tank as ammunition cooked off. The advance faltered. If you are watching this and hoping they make it through, take a moment and subscribe. These men faced impossible odds every single day, and their story is just beginning to unfold. Heinrich collapsed against the gun breech, his entire body shaking. Around him, his crew was bleeding, traumatized, barely functional. They had survived 2 engagements. According to the statistics, they had maybe 3 more before the numbers caught up with them. But they were still alive. For now, that had to be enough. The third week at Silo Heights broke something fundamental in all of them. The Soviet offensive intensified with a fury that defied comprehension. Entire forests disappeared under artillery barrages. The sky turned black with smoke that never cleared. At night, the horizon glowed orange with burning vehicles and towns. Number 217 had become a ghost machine. Matthias drove with one arm, his shoulder wound, poorly healed and infected. Ernst was completely deaf on one side, relying on hand signals and instinct. Peter barely spoke anymore, just stared at his radio with empty eyes. Johann loaded shells with mechanical efficiency, never making conversation, never acknowledging the bodies of crews from other Nashorns that they passed daily. Heinrich had stopped counting kills after 30. What was the point? For every Soviet tank they destroyed, 10 more appeared. The math was simple and terrible. They were not winning. They were just dying slower than everyone else. On April 16th, the final Soviet assault began. Over 400 tanks attacked their sector simultaneously, supported by waves of infantry and constant artillery. The radio filled with screams, desperate calls for support, then static as positions were overrun one by one. Heinrich's hands moved automatically now. Target, range, fire, reload, target, range, fire. The 88mm gun grew so hot that the paint blistered off the barrel. They destroyed 11 tanks in the first hour, 14 by the second hour. The numbers meant nothing. A Soviet shell finally found them at 1,400 hours. Not a direct hit, but close enough. The blast flipped the Nashorn onto its side, throwing all 5 crew members like rag dolls. Heinrich came to consciousness upside down, trapped under twisted metal, tasting blood. He could hear someone screaming. It took several seconds to realize it was Ernst. The gunner was pinned under the breech of the main gun, his legs crushed. Peter was not moving at all, his neck bent at an impossible angle. Matthias and Johann were crawling out through a gap in the armor, both injured but mobile. "We have to go," Matthias shouted, pulling at Heinrich. "Soviet infantry will be here in minutes." Heinrich tried to reach Ernst, but the metal had him completely trapped. The gunner looked at Heinrich with clarity despite the agony. "Go," Ernst said through gritted teeth. "You cannot help me. I will not leave you." Ernst grabbed Heinrich's collar, pulled him close. "You already stayed too long. You die here with me, or you live and remember us. Choose." Soviet voices echoed closer now, harsh commands in Russian. Matthias physically dragged Heinrich away from the wreck. They ran, stumbled, crawled through smoke and fire. Behind them, Heinrich heard Ernst's scream cut short by gunfire. They reached German lines 2 hours later, 3 survivors out of 55 men who had started with Unit 525. Heinrich collapsed in a trench, looked at his shaking hands, and understood finally why 68% died. It was never about the thin armor or the open top. It was about being asked to fight a war that was already lost. The war ended 3 weeks later. Heinrich, Matthias, and Johann were among the last German soldiers to surrender to Soviet forces outside Berlin. They spent 6 months in a prisoner of war camp near Minsk, sleeping on dirt floors, eating watery soup, watching men die from dysentery and typhus. But they were alive, and that simple fact felt like both a blessing and a curse. Heinrich could not sleep without seeing Ernst's face, hearing Otto's last whispered question, watching Peter's body bent at that terrible angle. The survivor's guilt ate at him like acid. Why had he lived when better men had died? What made him special? Nothing. Just luck. Just the random chance of which shell landed where. When the Soviets finally released them in late 1945, Heinrich returned to Kassel to find his family home reduced to rubble. His parents had died in an air raid. His sister had fled west and he had no way to locate her. Klaus, his younger brother, had been killed in the final days defending Berlin. Heinrich learned this from a neighbor who had survived, an old woman who wept when she told him. He was 24 years old and had nothing left except memories he desperately wanted to forget. Matthias found work as a truck driver, using his one good arm to haul reconstruction materials across the shattered country. Johann disappeared entirely, never leaving a forwarding address, perhaps trying to outrun his own ghosts. Heinrich took whatever jobs he could find, digging through ruins, clearing rubble, helping rebuild the country that had sent him to die. One afternoon in the spring of 1946, Heinrich was working a demolition site when he found something in the rubble. A child's toy soldier, battered but intact. He picked it up, turned it over in his scarred hands, and suddenly he was back in number 217, watching Otto load shells, hearing Ernst call out ranges, feeling the machine rock with every shot. He sat down in the ruins and wept for the first time since the war ended. Great heaving sobs that came from somewhere deep and broken inside him. He cried for his crew, for his brother, for all the young men who had climbed into those metal coffins and never climbed back out. An old man working nearby approached him slowly. "You were a soldier," the man said. It was not a question. Heinrich nodded, unable to speak. The old man sat beside him in the rubble. "My son drove a Nashorn. He did not come home." Heinrich looked at him, this stranger who understood without explanation. What was his name? Karl Weber. He was 19. Heinrich closed his eyes. "I am sorry. I am so sorry." The old man placed a weathered hand on Heinrich's shoulder. "You survived. That means you carry them forward. You remember them. That is the only victory left to claim." In that moment, surrounded by the ruins of everything he had known, Heinrich understood what he had to do. Not forget, but remember. Not hide, but honor. Not die with them, but live for them. 30 years later, in 1976, Heinrich Müller stood in a small museum in Munster, Germany, staring at a restored Nashorn tank destroyer. His hair had gone gray, his back stooped from decades of labor, but his eyes were still the same pale blue that had looked through gun sights across the Seelow Heights. Beside him stood his daughter, Anna, 23 years old, the same age he had been when he commanded number 217. She had never known war, had grown up in a Germany rebuilt and peaceful. She studied the machine with curiosity, running her hand along the thin armor plating. "Papa," she said quietly, "this is what you drove?" Heinrich nodded, his throat tight. "Yes. This one is number 340. Mine was 217. It looks so vulnerable." The top is completely open. That was the problem. We could kill at incredible distances, but anything could kill us. Artillery, aircraft, even rifle fire from the right angle. The statistics said 68% of crews became casualties. Out of my original unit of 55 men, only 3 of us survived the war. Anna looked at her father with new understanding. You never told me the details before. Heinrich had spent 3 decades building a new life. He had married Maria, a nurse who had treated him for pneumonia in 1947. They had raised 2 children. He had worked as an engineer, helping design safer machinery, teaching apprentices. He had lived deliberately, carefully, making sure that every day counted for something. But he had also written letters, hundreds of them, to the families of Otto, Ernst, Peter, and every other member of Unit 525 he could trace, sharing memories, offering what small comfort he could. Some families never responded. Others wrote back with gratitude, hungry for any detail about their lost sons, brothers, fathers. In 1968, Heinrich had helped organize a memorial in Kassel for the tank destroyer crews. 42 names carved in stone, including Ernst, Otto, and Peter. Every year on April 16th, the date of the final assault at Silo Heights, Heinrich placed flowers there. Sometimes other survivors joined him. Matthias came when his health allowed. Johann never appeared, but Heinrich hoped he had found peace somewhere. Anna squeezed her father's hand. I am proud of you, Papa. Not for the war, but for what you did after. For remembering them. Heinrich looked at the Nashorn one last time, this machine that had taken so much and given so little except impossible odds and the weight of survival. He thought of Weber's words on that frozen morning in 1944, about using speed and distance as armor. But the real armor, he had learned, was not steel or tactics or luck. It was memory. It was bearing witness. It was making sure that the 68% who never came home were not forgotten in the pages of history books, reduced to mere statistics. If the story moved you, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment sharing your thoughts, and subscribe to the channel. Share what topics you would like us to cover next. These stories matter. These men mattered. Thank you for watching until the end, for bearing witness with me, and for keeping their memory alive.